Even as Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw's famous Army of Liberation crushed the last pockets of resistance in East Pakistan, India was fighting a bitter war against itself just across the border. Facing a growing tide of protest and killing by Maoists, West Bengal Chief Minister Siddharth Shankar Ray's government had unleashed a vigilante army of tens of thousands against communists seeking a revolution. Large mobs of Congress supporters, often supported by state and central police, hunted down Maoists in the streets of Kosipur Baranagar and slaughtered rebels in Barasat. In some cases, the leaders of the Maoists were shot dead in Kolkata's lanes, often in full view of dozens of witnesses. Historian Manas Roy, an eyewitness to those days, has written. In others, the police didn't trouble themselves walking suspects down the roads in the heat. They simply delivered the coup de grace inside the police station itself. The scholar Bodhayan Chattopadhyay, an economics professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, and a member of a government-appointed committee to study the Naxalite problem, put the numbers of young people killed in those bloody years at 3,000. Grisly episodes of wholesale liquidation of teenagers have been reported in the West Bengal press, he wrote in the National Herald. Bodies and mass graves continue to be discovered by dogs, jackals and vultures long after the wave had receded. 50 years ago, the threat of urban Maoist violence, what we today call Urban Naxals, had been stamped out, at least in the city of Kolkata. Left revolutionary threat seemed to recede as Prime Minister Indira Gandhi basked in the glow of her two victories, the triumph against Pakistan in the east and against Urban Naxals at home. This second war we don't talk very much around. There are no memorials to the dead, or for that matter, to the victors. Welcome to this episode of The Print Explorer. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. This week, as politicians have trampled around the country in the heat and the dust, two events have passed almost completely unnoticed. The Supreme Court held the arrest of the journalist Prabir Purkayastha, alleged to have illegally received funding from the People's Republic of China, to be illegal. The courts also granted bail to Gautam Navlakha, a left-wing intellectual who's been a key figure in intellectual circles close to the Maoists, and was accused, among other things, of participating in the Bhima Koregaon plot, which prosecutors say involved an attempt to assassinate Prime Minister Narendra Modi. For our purposes today, the details of these cases aren't important. You can find a lot of fantastic investigative reporting as well as some great analysis on the Print's website if you're interested. What I want to look at though is this whole business of Urban Naxals, a term that led both men and many others to jail. Exactly what is an Urban Naxal? How serious is the Maoist threat in our cities? Is there even a threat? Or is this one of those moral panics which lead countries into irrational policy responses from time to time, like the infamous Red Scare which paralyzed the United States in the 1950s? The issue is complicated even further by the fact that this term Urban Naxals is used very loosely as a term of almost abuse to describe all kinds of people, from serious left-wing revolutionaries who were actually part of the Maoist movement to undergraduates smoking pot on the back lawns of a campus somewhere. If, like me, you're old enough to have listened to the wonderful Screamin' Jay Hawkins as an undergraduate, you'll know urban Maoists have fire pouring from their eyes and smoke billowing from their head. But seriously, let me present you with two quotes that I think sum up the issue at stake in this debate. And here's the first. I'm convinced that this is one rebellion which will test the resilience of the Indian state as never before, precisely because it is a rebellion in which people are fighting to save their land, forests, water and minerals from being grabbed, and they are convinced that they have an alternative vision. That's the man who's just got bail, Gautam Navlakha, Urban Naxal par excellence. The second is someone who, as an undergraduate, left the prestigious St. Stephen's College in New Delhi to go away and become a Maoist, but came back and built a distinguished academic career, the historian Dilip Simian. And this is what he said. The Naxalite movement is not a movement of landless peasants and tribals who are seeking to overthrow state power. It's a project defined as such by those who are neither peasants nor workers nor tribals, but claim to represent their interests. So, what is this debate all about? Finding a definition for who's an urban Naxal is surprisingly difficult. You'd think that there would be at least some definition for the threat the country has spent so much time fighting against. But if you look through the entire official record, you won't find one. The Home Minister, Amit Shah, has of course used this term. The Prime Minister quite recently cautioned the people of Gujarat to beware of urban Naxals, saying they threatened the state's development. Except nobody knows how to recognize an urban Naxal really, except maybe the director Vivek Agnihotri, who made a movie about them. The Ministry of Home Affairs, in an authoritative statement, says it doesn't use the term and therefore doesn't need a definition. There's no definition in any criminal case, in any sort of textbook analysis of this phenomenon. Well, fortunately for us, the Communist Party of India, Maoist, whose leaders are serious guys who tended to do very well in college, much better than me, have left us with some important clues. In 2007, the CPI Maoist issued a perspective document, as it called it, outlining its plans to expand into urban areas, which is where this whole urban Naxal debate began. The timing of this document was quite important. As you'll see from data from the authoritative South Asia Terrorism Portal, which should come up on the screen now, the Communist Party of India, Maoist, had successfully revived insurgent violence, which had been ticking up pretty steadily since 2001. And by 2007, Maoists thought the time had come to take their struggle forward. The CPIM, Communist Party of India Maoist perspective document, noted that cities were the locus of power of the Indian state. I quote, "The cities are the strongholds of the enemy and have a large concentration of enemy forces." To challenge this, the party called for secret cells to be set up which would penetrate the ruling establishment. The work is of a very special type, the document says, which requires a high degree of political reliability, skill, and patience. Like jihadists did, the CPI Maoist wanted to set up action teams to operate in urban areas. I quote, "Small secret teams of disciplined and trained soldiers of the People's Guerrilla Army or the People's Liberation Army who are permanently based in the cities or towns to hit important selected enemy targets. Such targets may be the annihilation of individuals of military importance, or sabotage actions like the blowing up of ammunition depots, destroying communication networks, damaging oil installations, etc." So, that was a pretty serious declaration of intent. The CPI Maoist wanted to carry its insurgency from the countryside to the towns, and that's important for reasons I'll come to in a minute. Now, if you read that document very, very carefully, you will see that it clearly recognized that the Maoist movement's bases were in rural areas, and also that the vast bulk of the party's attention was on its work in those rural areas. The cities sure would serve as logistic hubs to get arms and ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, but it anticipated that all the fighting would be out in the countryside. Left-wing groups also interjected themselves around this time in a variety of struggles around the country, ranging from the caste struggles of Dalits in Bhima Koregaon or the anti-nuclear protests at Kudankulam in Tamil Nadu. The Bhima Koregaon case is pretty interesting, by the way, in its own right, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. In 2018, Dalit organizations marked 200 years of the Battle of Koregaon. Now, that day had been celebrated by Dalits in Maharashtra because it was an epic battle against a Brahmin king. The problem was the Dalits who fought in that battle were soldiers of the East India Company, and some people thought it was anti-national to be celebrating a defeat of an Indian prince by the East India Company. Of course, Dalits didn't see it in those terms. In August 2018, 5 prominent civil rights activists, Urban Naxals if you want, were arrested under several provisions of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and accused of having links to the Maoists, conspiring to assassinate the Prime Minister, and planning to overthrow the state. The public prosecutor Ujjwala Pawar said this: "The word Urban Naxal is not defined, but the way they have been using pen drives and gadgets to spread their agenda can be the right definition of the term." So, my reading of that sentence is that she felt that Urban Naxal was someone who conducted propaganda, not necessarily someone who was actually involved in armed action. There's nothing to show, though, that these urban Naxals were especially successful. Perhaps they might have been in the very long term, perhaps not. We'll never know, because late in 2009, the Union government launched Operation Green Hunt to crush Maoists in Bastar and elsewhere. We've discussed that operation in an earlier episode of Explorer, and I might come back to it at some point. In the years between them and the Bhima Koregaon incident, the power of Maoist groups had diminished quite significantly. Now, why did the government panic in the way it did to this spectre of urban penetration by the Maoists? Well, I suspect it's because the government of India also knew that its real power lay in cities. Mahatma Gandhi might have thought of India as a nation of villages, but wealth and power come from India's urban core. Measured by killings, violence was to peak 3 years later in 2010, by which time Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Bengal, Odisha and Maharashtra were all seeing really high and rising levels of violence. Experts were panicked. You can see from records and conferences and seminars from around that time that people were talking about Maoist resurgence that could sweep aside the Indian state in rural areas, and genuinely worried about the future of the republic. This had something, in my opinion, to do with the mystique around the Maoist conception of warfare. In essence, the Chinese leader Mao Zedong, who staged a successful revolution in China and of course became its first leader, argued that insurgents should avoid direct conflict with the state until they were in a position to confront its armed forces. When that stage came, they should surround and choke the country's cities and thus eventually bring about the downfall of the regime. The Chinese did that pretty successfully, and in the years after 2003, both the governments and the Maoists thought things were headed in that direction. And then there's this odd fact. For all the fuss, for all the panic, the Maoists were unable to carry out a single urban operation of any consequence, unless you count a jailbreak from Jehanabad in 2005, and that was before the Maoist document was written in 2007. Sure, there were strikes. There were strikes in 2006 in which trade unions sympathetic to the CPI Maoist were involved, notably at the bank, at public sector banks and at the Hero Honda factory on the periphery of Delhi. The main forces in these strikes, though, were unions linked to mainstream parties. The trade unions of both the Congress party and the Bharatiya Janata party were deeply suspicious of liberalization and privatization. So in this business, they were on the same side as the Maoists. I'll repeat this just to sum up. Even as they butchered large numbers of police in Bastar and West Bengal and Odisha, India's Maoists were either unable or unwilling to stage a single operation in a city of significance. Yes, some Maoist leaders during this period did locate themselves in urban centers like Venkatesh Reddy, who was known as Telugu Deepak. But actually, these leaders shifting to cities was fantastic news for counter-terrorism organizations like the police in Andhra Pradesh. You see, the police had very successfully penetrated the Maoist leadership in previous years, and when these guys moved to cities, they were easy to arrest. It's a lot easier to pick up someone on the nice streets of a city, as the scholar Ajay Sani has pointed out, than tramping around in a jungle in Bastar looking for them. So, how did Maoists appreciate the military situation as it evolved? There are some very interesting glimpses in an assessment made by the CPI Maoists Central Military Commission in 2012. And here's what it says. People are fighting against price rises, unemployment, famine and starvation deaths. Retail traders are fighting against foreign direct investments. Indian Airlines, Air India pilots, bank and insurance employees, workers and students are fighting against privatization in their sectors. So it's an opportunity. The interesting thing to me here, as an analyst of conflicts, is that there's nothing very revolutionary about any of this. Indian Airlines pilots or bank employees weren't looking to become the proletarian vanguard and overthrow the Indian state. And this kind of language, the rich are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer. You will hear people say this, you'll find it written about in newspapers every day of the week. And by the time all this was written significantly, levels of Maoist violence were actually starting to decline, although very few people noted it at the time. So the question has to be asked, are India's revolutionaries really revolutionary? The historian Kathleen Gough points out that there have been 7 major uprisings in the period after independence up until 1977, that is the end of the emergency. The first 4 were conducted by the Communist Party of India before it split into 2 wings in 1964. Those were at Tebhaga in northern Bengal starting in 46, just before independence. The Telangana uprising, a peasant uprising, which had to be put down by the military with savage violence against Dalits and Adivasis. A strike of tenants and landless labourers in eastern Tanjavur in Tamil Nadu in 1948. And short strikes followed by attacks on granaries and grain trucks in Kerala in 46-48. According to Gough, the other 3 uprisings were led by Maoist groups which began to break away from the Communist Party of India in 1967. There was a peasant struggle involving land claims in 1971, led by the Andhra Pradesh Revolutionary Communist Committee, an uprising in Naxalbari in West Bengal in 1967, very, very famous. The annihilation campaign of the Communist Party of India, ML, against landlords and political landlords, moneylenders and political enemies, which was most intense in Srikakulam in 1969-1970. Now, what do these uprisings and others of their kind, which took place even in the pre-independence period without this communist label, tell us? Well, they tell us there's very deep deprivation in rural areas and that there are very sharp conflicts over social inequality in search of a catalyst. In a previous episode, we looked at rebellions which took place in Bastar and elsewhere in the colonial period, which very often revolved around a shaman or a local princely ruler against colonial authority or against the power of moneylenders and outside influences. So this wasn't a new thing in the Indian landscape. This was very often when Maoists arrived in an area in these peasant rebellions after independence. They were welcomed by local communities because they brought weapons and thus tilted the balance of power between their oppressors and the community, not because the communities were sitting there reading Marx and Mao and had been radicalized by it. In other words, the Maoists weren't using the villagers were using the Maoists. And in a delightful essay, the scholar Alpa Shah has described Maoists in Jharkhand, for example, as a kind of Alcoholics Anonymous chapter for, back of the beyond communities, heroically trying to do virtuous things and stamp out abuse of local distilled spirits. She has this wonderful description of what she saw firsthand. 15 men in olive green uniforms, some with sticks and batons in hand, leapt off the bikes and straight towards them. The men started kicking over and hitting aluminium and clay pots, shouting, "Stop drinking and selling alcohol! Long live the MCC, the Maoist Coordination Center." In the mayhem that followed, pots cracked and liquor poured onto the ground and villagers started screaming and wailing. Well, the mission of civilizing Adivasi savages is, of course, exactly what Hindu nationalists and Christian missionaries have spent decades doing. The Maoists weren't there, as some sort of radical force embracing Adivasis as their own. They were out there doing sudhar, doing reform. Even though these movements were crushed without difficulty, what you might call the Maoist impulse was not. The consolidation that led to an expansion of the sphere of revolutionary activity again began in 1997. The expert and my colleague K. Srinivas Reddy has written. Various sort of little splinter groups that had disintegrated into in the 1970s, Marxist-Leninist groups. So you can list among them the Communist Party of India, Maoist-Leninists, the Maoist Unity Center, merged with the CPIM Maoist-Leninist Naxalbari, the CPI Marxist-Leninist Red Flag merged with the CPI Marxist-Leninist Naxalbari, the Revolutionary Communist Centre of India Maoist operating in Punjab united with the Maoist Communist Centre, and the Bihar-based party Unity merged with the Communist Party of India Marxist-Leninist People's War, which was based in Andhra Pradesh. So I don't know if any of you have ever watched this wonderful Monty Python comedy called The Life of Brian, which has this wonderful series of, assassination squads in the Middle East, all naming themselves with a bizarre set of acronyms and letters, this real alphabet soup, and then slaughtering each other over tiny perceived differences. But that's what the Maoist movement had become. But in the late 1990s, they all sort of came together. The splits reversed. Reddy has this wonderful analogy of little spots of oil scattered across, joining each other to reform a kind of film of a slick over a large area. So the Maoist groups, through this process of unity and cohesion, were able to increase their area of activity and also their cadre and sympathizer base. These potential revolutionaries not only were thus able to bring their ideas into newer areas, but also make determined efforts to reclaim areas where the Maoist movement had been crushed. This happened in West Bengal, of course, where Naxalbari happened, Andhra Pradesh. Yet, the Maoists were unable to expand these movements out of this handful of areas. There was no new Maoist insurgency in any state. This is because, in my view, most Indian peasants had no interest in overthrowing the state. They wanted the state to work better for them. They wanted to be freed of injustice. They wanted to be left alone. But they were not interested in forming some kind of revolutionary military organization. And there are two important takeaways from that about why violence actually escalated and grew. The economist Christian Helscher and others have made the very interesting point that I quote, and listen to this carefully: unending violence may actually be the desired equilibrium for all the parties to the conflict. Does that sound weird, that everyone would actually want a state of violence to persist? Well, think about it. The Maoists made a lot of money for their movement from extorting mining companies operating in Bastar, for example. The companies gained access to land they could mine on when militia were set up in southern Chhattisgarh that forced Adivasis to relocate in camps closer to the road. Funds flowed into development projects, enriching both local elites and the Maoists who extorted money for them. Everyone loves a war except the people who get killed in them. And perhaps the bureaucracy was happy too. We talk about schools that didn't function, government offices that were abandoned. But who would want to be an administrator or a teacher or a doctor working in a back of beyond village? It's much nicer to be legitimately able to sit in the district headquarters and say you just can't go out to help people. Second, when you go to war, you create powerful vested interests for pursuing the war. The Urban Naxal meme empowered police and opened new avenues for funding local and provincial governments. Hyping the threat made perfect sense. Ajay Sani has noted that a single incident, not necessarily a violent attack, allowed a district to classify itself as Maoist affected, which is why through this period in the late 2000s you see a surge in allegedly left-wing extremism affected districts. The minute you got declared a troubled district, you became eligible for all kinds of central grants and subsidies and money. So who wouldn't want to be a little bit Maoist affected? Like I said, everyone loves a good war. Fears of urban Naxalism have fled up periodically, and not just when there's some feud at Jawaharlal Nehru University or students are marching against the Citizenship Amendment Act or whatever. In 2016 and again in 2017, the derailment of trains in Kanpur, Motihari and Koneru raised a great deal of fears that Maoist cells were now dynamiting tracks and renewing their offensives on urban areas. The railway's own investigators, though, who I assume knew a little bit about trains, felt that mechanical causes were the likely cause, not bombs. There have been no arrests for terrorism in any of these train blast cases, supposed train blast cases. There was talk, if you go through newspapers from this period, of jihadists linking up with Maoists or Indian Maoists linking up with Nepali Maoists. There hasn't, if you go through the records, been a single case of any such evolution. You'll still see periodic reports of Maoists infiltrating trade unions, but I've always been a little amused by this because the last several years have been a period of retreat for trade unions. They are hardly a consequential force in Indian politics today, unlike Indian politics at the cusp of liberalization. The disproportionate response of police and intelligence organizations to the threat, though, is at least as dangerous as the threat itself. In the Bhima Koregaon case, there are credible allegations that evidence was actually manufactured and then planted on the computers of the accused persons. That it's taken so many years to try the case is scandalous enough. That those allegations have not been seriously investigated undermines the credibility of the Indian state. And after all, the Indian state, like any other nation state, ultimately derives its legitimacy from being a vehicle for the delivery of justice and the protection of law. If it doesn't deliver either of those, then it's not really that different from the Maoists or any other terrorists. The threat has also justified extrajudicial violence and executions. There are credible allegations that the Maoists supposedly killed last month in Bastar in a much hailed firefight were actually unarmed civilians. Tendu leaf pickers who were basically passed off as terrorists by police. These allegations might be true, these allegations might not be true, but the fact that there is no serious investigation into them underway is disturbing. So what of our urban Naxals? Should we be worried or not? There's no doubt that there are many Maoist sympathizers living in our cities, just as there are Hindu nationalists, Congress backers, liberals, authoritarians, communists, and just lackadaisical middle-of-the-roaders such as myself. The whole point of a democratic polity, though, is that all these different voices and currents learn to coexist. The myth of the urban Naxal has led to the unraveling of a polity, where we are at each other's throats instead of talking to each other. That could be something India might end up paying a far higher price for than insurgents have ever been able to inflict. Thank you again for watching this episode of The Print Explorer.